Yep. Thank you for that. I, I I want to thank y'all for giving me this opportunity. It's a great honor to be able to speak to students, and I count it a great thing whenever anybody wants to discuss matters that I think are of great importance and interest to me, especially um, something that I've spent a good amount of time thinking and writing about myself. What we'll be talking about today is Hume and miracles, and in particular, I'll be talking about what I've titled Ex-Hume-ing miracles, because I'll be talking about some problems with Hume's argument against miracles. I want to start off with some preliminary discussion about what is a miracle. And there are three traits that I think that we should use to define or to pick out what a miracle is. First, a miracle is an action that is performed by God. Secondly, that a miracle would be a deviation from the natural course of events, the way that things would naturally go apart from God's agency. And then thirdly, that miracles are performed for a divine purpose. And usually it's to put a kind of stamp of approval or authenticity onto some kind of revelation as God's revelation. Miracles are different from providential events. So miraculous events are different from providential events in a certain way. So you might think that divine providence takes place when God is working through the natural course of events to accomplish his ends. So, for example, we might think that Esther, the example in the Bible where she is put into a place of royal authority in the Persian Empire to help the Jews who are very desperate and in a very bad situation, that was not a miraculous event, that was a providential event. The natural course of events is not interrupted or changed through divine action. Rather, divine providence was working through the natural course of events. And there's this famous passage from Esther where it says of her, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And the idea there is that God is working providentially through the course of nature. When we talk about miracles, we're not talking about providential events. What we're talking about are miraculous events. So far, is that pretty good? Is the sound and everything working out on your end okay? All right. So if we move to slide 3, it's important that we understand that miracles are an important part to Christianity. And there are a number of reasons for this. First, because the resurrection of Jesus is a miraculous event. So if miracles don't take place, if miracles are impossible, then the resurrection didn't take place. The resurrection isn't possible. Miracles are used as God's authentication for revelation, so that when we look at, if you go through the book of Acts, for example, in the book of Acts, the phrase signs and wonders are used in conjunction with what the apostles are doing very often. It's a very interesting study to do this. And what it's showing us is that God uses miraculous events to put his authentication on appointing people like the apostles to be his spokesmen. And thirdly, just in general, the Bible testifies that numerous miraculous events took place. So, if miracles don't happen, if miracles are unbelievable, then that is a big problem for Christianity, because the center of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus. Miracles are part of the way that God uses to authenticate his revelation, and the Bible generally speaks about miracles as things that do in fact take place. So if miracles can't take place, it hurts the credibility of the Bible. to very quickly sum up this is to say that rejecting miracles is to reject Christianity. Now, in slide 4, there are, very broadly speaking, three kinds of problems that philosophers raise concerning miracles. There's first what we might call the broad possibility problem, which is just the question of whether miracles are possible events. There are some philosophers, not many, but there are an important number of interesting philosophers who have said that miracles aren't even possible, that they're incoherent, that it is an illogical kind of event. And that would fall under the first problem. The second problem is the problem that we might call the general epistemic problem. And the general epistemic problem raises the question, is it possible for miraculous claims to be epistemically justified? And here, the miraculous claims should be thought in a very broad and general class. Is it possible, broadly speaking, for miraculous claims to be epistemically justified? And the third kind of problem that philosophers raise with miracles could be called the specific epistemic problem, which is the question, is there evidence that epistemically justifies that a specific miracle has occurred? And these are problems that take place on different levels. What we will be talking about, the problem that Hume has raised, is the second. Hume is raising a general epistemic problem. On the next slide, I have a few further things to say about this. The general epistemic problem grants the possibility for a miraculous event. So those who raise this problem are not saying that miracles are incoherent or illogical or impossible. They grant the very possibility that a miracle could take place. However, the general epistemic problem denies that one is ever justified in believing that a miraculous event has occurred because of the very nature of what a miracle is. And the way that this works is you could sort of imagine a very basic strategy here. Whenever confronted with the evidence for a miraculous event, claim that one is always justified in believing that something non-miraculous must have occurred instead. So when somebody puts forward evidence that a miracle took place, instead, just say there's got to be some other explanation, and whatever other explanation could be brought up is always more believable. On the next slide, I've got a citation for a passage I'm going to read to you from a New Testament scholar from a textbook that is used in a number of classes across the world. It's the book, The New Testament, A Historical Introduction to the Early Christian Writings by Bart Ehrman. And this is what Ehrman says about miracles. And this is an example of the use of the general epistemic problem today. He says, as events that defy all probability, miracles create an inescapable dilemma for historians. Since historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and the chances of a miracle happening by definition are infinitesimally remote, they can never demonstrate that a miracle probably happened. This is not a problem for only one kind of historian, for atheists or agnostics or Buddhists or Roman Catholics or Baptists or Jews or Muslims. It is a problem for all historians of every stripe. Even if they are otherwise good sources for a miraculous event, the very nature of the historical discipline prevents the historian from arguing for its probability. Let me illustrate the problem with a hypothetical example. Suppose that 3 otherwise credible eyewitnesses claim to see Reverend Jones of the Plymouth Baptist Church walk across his parishioner's pond in 1926. The historian can certainly discuss what can be known about the case, who the eyewitnesses were, what they claim they saw, what can be known about the body of water in question, and so forth. What the historian cannot claim, however, at least when discussing the matter as a historian, is that the Reverend Jones actually did it. This is more than we can know using the canons of historical knowledge. The problem of historical probabilities restrains our conclusion. For the fact is that we all know several thousand people, none of whom can walk across pools of water, but all of whom at one time or another have been mistaken about what they thought they saw, or have been misquoted, or have exaggerated, or have flat out lied. To be sure, such activities may not be probable, especially for the upstanding members of the Plymouth Baptist Church, but they would be more probable than a miracle that defies the normal workings of nature. Thus, if we as historians can only say what probably happened, we cannot say, as historians, that the good Reverend probably performed a miracle. I should emphasize that historians do not have to deny the possibility of miracles or deny that miracles have actually happened in the past. Many historians, for example, committed Christians, observant Jews, and practicing Muslims believe that they have in fact happened. When they think or say this, however, they do so not in the capacity of the historian, but in the capacity of the believer. And that's from Bart Ehrman's book, The New Testament. Now, you'll notice what he said about miracles. He says that you cannot have historical evidence or probable grounds for concluding a miracle took place because in our experience we're much more acquainted with people who lie, who misrepresent, who misquote, and so on. This is exactly what Hume is saying. And you'll notice that what Ehrman was saying was that miracles could happen. You might think it's possible they take place. It's just that he doesn't think you could have probable or rational grounds for making that conclusion. What I want to look at, what Ehrman was doing is just reporting what he thinks is the case. As historians, this is what we do. What I would like to look at is the underpinnings of the argument for that. And that is what we're going to start looking at with Hume's argument. On slide 7, we have a picture of Hume's beautiful mug. You'll see that he is an 18th century Scottish philosopher and historian. He's infamous for his radical version of empiricism and skepticism. Now, the main text that we're going to be looking at is part 1 of the essay Of Miracles, which is chapter 10 in his book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And the first edition was published 1748. And when we look at this passage, one thing to look at is that Hume really does think that he's doing something ingenious and new and revolutionary with his argument. And I've got this quote from the second paragraph. He says, "I flatter myself that I have discovered an argument which, if just, will, with the wise and learned, be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusion, and consequently will be useful as long as the world endures." In other words, Hume is saying, I've come up with a brand new argument against miracles, and if I'm right, there's no need for us to even look into the evidence for any miraculous claims, because I've come up with an ingenious way to dismiss any putative miraculous claim. Now, what exactly is this argument? I've got a very long quote that's going to span slides 8 and 9. I'm going to read that. If it's not entirely clear, just listen as I read it aloud. If you can read it on the screen, follow along. Here's Hume's argument. He says, "A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Why is it more than probable that all men must die, that lead cannot of itself remain suspended in air, that fire consumes wood and is extinguished by water, unless it be that these events are found agreeable to the laws of nature, and there is required a violation of these laws, or in other words, a miracle, to prevent them? Nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happen in the common course of nature. It is no miracle that a man, seemingly in good health, should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death, though more unusual than any other, has yet been frequently observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event. Otherwise, the event would not merit that appellation. And as a uniform experience amounts to a proof, there's here a direct and full proof from the nature of the fact against the existence of any miracle. And that's the heart of Hume's argument. On the next slide, I've got my summary of how the flow of the argument is supposed to go on slide 10 here. Hume's argument, you could say, boils down to these three premises. Premise 1, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Now, when Hume says something is a law of nature, what he's saying is that it is a descriptive law of nature, that the laws of nature are our way of trying to describe regularities that we have seen to take place without any exception. So a miracle would be some kind of violation of those observations that we make regularly. Secondly, those laws of nature are uniformly and universally confirmed by our past experiences. So that in our past experiences, we've never seen any kind of law of nature that ever has an exception to it. You've never, for example, seen gravity suspended. You've never seen, when you've put two magnets together, you never see them not operate according to the law of magnetism. And thirdly, he wants to say that all reasonable judgments about matters of fact must rely on past experience. So that when we make any judgments about things, we look to what has taken place in the past in order to inform what we should think will take place in the future. Based on these three reasons, we get the conclusion, which is proposition 4, it is never reasonable to believe a miracle occurred. And this is what Hume thinks is his knockdown argument against miracles. Now on slide 11, I have a little bit to say about this conclusion, because I think it's important to realize what he is saying and what he isn't saying. So the conclusion is that it is never reasonable to believe a miracle occurred on the basis of evidence. Now this goes beyond the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Hume's point is different. Now he does grant that miracles are possible, but he's saying that no evidence of any kind could, in principle, justify believing that a miracle occurred. So he's trying to say that there is no reason whatsoever to believe that a miracle has occurred. It could have taken place, but there's no evidence that could ever meet the burden of proof because of the kind of event that a miracle is. There are philosophers today who don't think this is what Hume's argument is supposed to imply. And what I would say in response to that is that Hume's contemporaries interpreted his argument exactly this way, including John Leland, William Adams, Richard Price, and George Campbell. And Hume corresponded with many of these men, and in his correspondences and exchanges of ideas, he never says that they misunderstood his argument. So if this isn't what Hume meant, he did not take the time to point this out during his own lifetime. Now, on the next slide, we're going to see how Hume would deal with something like the resurrection. So once again, I'm going to read an excerpt from Of Miracles here. Hume says, "When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision, and always reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then and not till then can he pretend to command my belief or opinion." So you see what Hume is doing here. If somebody reports that they have seen a dead man restored to life, Hume is thinking, look, in my past experience, dead men stay dead without exception. So if somebody tells me they saw a dead man restored to life, what's more likely, that the dead man came back to life, or that this person is lying or has been deceived by someone else and sincerely but falsely believes that someone's been raised from the dead? Hume is going to say, well, past experience tells me that people don't come back from the dead, so I don't even have to look into the evidence for this claim. And obviously we can see how this is going to impact the Christian claim that Jesus Christ has been resurrected from the dead. So here we are about midway through the presentation, and what I want to do now is turn from Hume's argument to criticisms, to problems with Hume's argument. And when we go to slide 13, you'll see the title, To Err is Humean. So Hume, I've got 5 problems with Hume's argument that I want to highlight. We'll see if we get to all 5. If we don't have time for the last one, then I'll probably will cut that or save that if in case there's a question about it. So let's talk about the first problem. The first problem has to do with the scope of personal experience. You'll notice that Hume is trying to say the reason why miracles are unbelievable is because, our past experience tells us not to believe in them. Well, what is the scope of past experience? Should the scope of the past experience be limited to one's own personal experience, or should it extend to the personal experience of all people? Now, if Hume were trying to include all people's past experiences, then this argument would just be question begging, right? He says in the passage that I read, he says, it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life because that has never been observed in any age or country. To which we say, really, how do you know that? If in fact what we read in the New Testament is correct, then this has been observed in some age and in some country by some particular men. So Hume, if he were just trying to say, well, everybody's experience excludes dead men rise, he's begging the question against the very evidence that is being raised. Now, that's not what Hume means. He's not making this gross begging of the question. What he's doing instead is he's really saying what I've got on the bottom of this slide, which is that we should rely on our personal experience to judge the credibility of others' testimony. So that when we hear someone else report a dead man came back to life, we should say, well, in my personal experience, I've never experienced that, so what they say must not be right. So in a way, the first problem sets up an initial kind of dilemma. If it's about all people's experiences, then it's begging the question. If it's about our own personal experience, then it's going to lead actually to the next several problems that I'm going to raise. So if we're looking at Hume as saying, measure all other testimony, measure all other evidence by the light of your own experience, let's see what happens if we were to grant him that. And for the next point, I want to begin with a lengthy quote from William Adams, and it spans slides 14 and 15 here. William Adams, I'll say, it was the first man to publish a response to Hume on miracles. So what I'm going to read to you is not something a philosopher wrote in the past 5, 10, 100 years, like 5 years, 10 years, or 100 years. What he's instead doing, this is somebody who wrote within Hume's own lifetime. And I think it's instructive to see that many of these arguments that we read about that endure through time had critics in their own lifetime, and many of whom, I think, were spot on in their criticisms. And William Adams, I think, is one of these. This is what one of the points William Adams makes on Hume. He says, experience teacheth us that lead and iron are heavier than water. But a man, by projecting these heavy bodies, may make them swim in water or fly in air. Should the same be done by any invisible power, it would be a miracle. But the uniformity of nature is no more disturbed in this case than the former. Nor is the general experience which witnesses to the superior gravity of these bodies. Any proof that they may not be raised in air and water by some invisible agent, as well as by the power of man. All that experience teaches is the comparative weight of these bodies. If, therefore, they are seen to float in mediums lighter than themselves, this must be the effect of art or strength. But if it be done without any visible art or power, it must be done then by some art or power that is invisible. That is, it must be miraculous. This is the process by which we infer the existence of miracles, which is therefore so far from being contradicted by that experience upon which the laws of nature are established, that it is closely connected and stands in the fairest agreement with it. This experience teaches what may be ordinarily expected from common causes in the common course of things. But miraculous interpositions, which we are inquiring after, are by their nature and essence extraordinary and out of the common course of nature. Miracles, if at all, are effects of an extraordinary power upon extraordinary occasions. Consequently, common experience can determine nothing concerning them. When we go to the next slide, we see this. This is what I think we should take from that passage I just read, which is the second problem, which is that our personal experience really does not provide, to borrow Hume's phrase, a uniform experience against every miraculous event. What William Adams was pointing out in that passage is that our personal experience tells us what the laws of nature do based on how things go through in the common course of things, or how nature works on its own, how it operates commonly. We don't see through our experience anything that says what nature cannot do or what cannot be done in nature by an agent. And that's what we would need if we're going to say that our past personal experience counts against or goes contrary to miracles. For our personal experience to be contrary to a miracle, actually, the experience would have to inform us of a contrary occurrence in the place of the purported miraculous event. So let's say if I claim that August 10th at noon, I saw a man rise from the dead in the middle of Auckland University. Now, besides the fact that I'm on the wrong side of the planet, let's say even that I was, in New Zealand, able to do this, the only experience that you could rely on that would go contrary to my claim would be your experience of being in that place at that time and saying, no, you didn't see that, I was there, it was something else, or no event took place, or the drama department was putting on a production and you were just misled by that. But to say, well, since I've never seen a dead man rise from the dead is an argument or is evidence against your position is to misunderstand things. It's just having no evidence for the claim. And Adams really drives this home. I've got one more quote on the next page from him, and it brings this point home. Adams says, "Here the author," referring to Hume, "seems to suppose that a want of experience, in any case, is the same with experiencing the contrary. When a fact attested hath seldom fallen under our observation, here is, says he, a contest of two opposite experiences. But in reality, here is no experience at all, only a fact not observed on one side, and positive evidence, or the fact attested on the other. A very unequal contest." So he's just driving home that when Hume says that our experience is experience against a miracle, it just isn't the case. What we experience is the common course of nature, and there's nothing in our experience that says an agent can't interfere with the common course of nature. Just as you and I can hold up a bar of lead above the ground and keep it from falling, why couldn't a divine agent do the exact same thing? On the next slide, we have our third problem with Hume. Problem number 3 is that our personal experience can actually be used to support miracles. So Hume says that the reason why we shouldn't believe in miracles is because our past experience gives us this uniform and universal evidence that the course of nature is always a certain way. Well, our personal experience also tells us that people are not willing to endure suffering unto death for proclaiming events that they know to be false. And once again, I have a nice quote from William Adams. He says that men should love falsehood rather than truth, that they should choose labor and travail, shame and misery before pleasure, ease and esteem, is as much a violation of the laws of nature as it is for lead or iron to hang unsupported in the air, or for the voice of a man to raise the dead to life. Now, what he's saying here is that in Hume's sense of the word of a law of nature is something that is confirmed by our universal and uniform past experiences, where we know of no exception to it. Well, in the same way, it seems like we have uniform and universal past experience that says people don't invent falsehoods, follow known lies, proclaim them nonstop when it brings shame, misery, and torture unto death, when they know those things to be false. In other words, our past experience says that people who give testimony under these circumstances are generally sincere. Now, sincerity in testimony is not the same thing as proving that their testimony is true. But if we can provide evidence that these witnesses are not deceived, then if they're not deceived and they are sincere, then it would be a violation of our uniform personal experience for people to endure suffering for proclaiming known falsehoods, which would count as evidence for a miracle. So based on our past personal experience of people who don't want to inflict hardships on themselves for giving false testimony, this is actually a good reason to think that maybe there could be evidence that supports miracles. Shifting to our next problem, we go to the next slide, and I want to introduce you to John Earman. He wrote a book. I've got the cover posted right there. It's called Hume's Abject Failure, The Argument Against Miracles. And John Earman, he is the Distinguished University Professor Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh. He is, without a doubt, one of the leading experts in the history and philosophy of science. Earman is not a theist. He does not believe in God, nor does he believe that miracles have occurred or that it's reasonable to believe that miracles have occurred. Nonetheless, he thinks that this general epistemic objection to miracles that Hume raised is an abject failure. From the preface, I've got the quote there where he says, "The attack on Hume is motivated purely by a desire to set the record straight and frame the issues in a way that makes a discussion of them more fruitful." So I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are people like John Earman who are objecting to Hume, and people who object to Hume are not doing so just because they think that they want to defend miracles. Rather, these are people who are objecting because there are serious problems with the argument. Now, on the next slide, I have a quote from Earman where he brings out one of the problems with Hume's theory is that if it were true, if we really followed Hume's problems with miracles fully through, it would stop science from progressing. So let me read this long passage from Earman, and then we'll go to the next slide and talk about what this means. So according to Earman, Hume's approach to miracles, if applied to science, is both descriptively inadequate to scientific practice, and it is stultifying to scientific inquiry. Among the zillions of protons observed by particle physicists, none has been verified to decay. But particle physicists do not assign a probability of 1, which is absolute certainty, to the proposition that the next proton to be observed will not decay, and they certainly do not think they have adequate inductive grounds for probabilistic certainty with respect to the general proposition that no proton ever decays. Otherwise, the expenditure of time and money on experiments to detect proton decay would be inexplicable. Let's go to the next slide and see what I'm trying to draw from this. This is what I call the stultification of science. And the idea is that if scientists allowed their uniform and universal personal experience to inform them of what is believable, regardless of the evidence, then science could not progress. Hume's argument with miracles does not match the actual practices of scientists. And if Hume's argument were followed by scientists, it would be paralyzing to scientific inquiry. So, to use Ehrman's example again, is the idea that scientists have never observed a proton decay. The universal and uniform experience of the past experiences of all scientists say protons don't decay. Do scientists treat that claim that protons don't decay with absolute certainty? No. If a scientist published a paper that said, I discovered a proton that decayed, and this is what happened, should all the scientists say, no way, because in my past experience, that has never happened? Of course not, and it would be irrational to dismiss somebody's view for that reason. And we can even think about this without even looking to scientific examples. I've never experienced Vegemite. In my experience, I know about Nutella, I know about peanut butter, I know about hummus. I've never had any experience of Vegemite. If I have my friends from the Southern Hemisphere tell me about Vegemite and its properties and its unique qualities, should I believe them or should I dismiss them and say, since I've never experienced that, it's more likely that they're inventing this or they're making it up? Think about another nice phenomena is when I flush the toilet in the Northern Hemisphere, it spirals in a clockwise fashion. And when you flush the toilet or pull the plug in a drain in a bathtub, it goes in a counterclockwise position, or so you tell me. However, if I were to follow Hume, I would have to say that my uniform past experience says that water always, and without exception, drains by making the little swirly thing in a clockwise fashion. Well, Hume would have me say that if you were to tell me otherwise, that I should think you're a liar or you are deceived, but in any case, you're not to be believed. Now, think about how this would go for all sorts of things in science. Maybe some of y'all haven't had these courses, but have you heard the things that scientists are saying about the quantum world, about the properties of quarks and leptons and bosons? Have you heard what scientists say about superstring theory and multiple dimensions? And these are things that are nowhere within the boundaries of our experience. They speak of things that we can't even begin to imagine, especially when it comes to multiple dimensions with string theory. Should we dismiss these claims because they are outside of our personal experience? They don't fit in with the way that we have observed the world? Hume would have us say yes. I think that we should be able to look at some of these things and say that when there is enough evidence, we can and we are allowed, it is justified for us to draw inferences and conclusions that go beyond our personal experience. And thank goodness, because if we couldn't, science would not progress. So that's the fourth problem. As we're approaching here, let me talk about the fifth problem. I might go real quickly through some technical parts of this, and I can try to leave some room for questions about this. The fifth problem is that testimony can and does overcome great improbabilities. Richard Price was one of the first critics to point out this in his work, 4 Dissertations. It was published in Hume's lifetime, and the part of this that actually talks about Hume's argument against miracles is the 4th dissertation. Hume actually interacted with Price and seems to have said something to the effect that, wow, your use of probability logic is really interesting. I don't really seem to understand it. Who knows what this will have to say about my claims. Charles Babbage, who is famous for advances in the way we think about computing, in his 9th Bridgewater treatise, also makes a similar point that Price does about independent eyewitness testimony and its ability to confirm very improbable events. And many philosophers today have written on this. And if you do an academic go through academic search engines and you look for publications by men like George Schlesinger, Richard Swinburne, Rodney Holder, John Ehrman, Timothy McGrew, and others, and you search their names with the word miracles, you're going to find some academic publications on this that have the same basic idea. On the next slide is the moral of this point, which is from Charles Babbage, where he says, if independent witnesses can be found who speak truth more frequently than falsehood, it is always possible to assign a number of independent witnesses the improbability of the falsehood of whose concurring testimony shall be greater than the improbability of the alleged miracle. So what he's saying there is that if you can get independent witnesses, there's a formal way of defining independence in probability theory, but intuitively you can think of it this way, that if there are 2 people whose testimonies are not related to one another, so that if one person were to give that testimony, it wouldn't affect whether the other person gives the testimony, and vice versa. So if you have 2 people who are giving some kind of testimony to an event that are independent of one another, and that their testimony, and that they're witnessing what they are testifying has just slightly more probability that they are credible than they are improbable, then we can find, in principle, it's always possible to find a number of these independent witnesses who would be able to overcome any improbability. And what I'd like to do, I'm actually going to skip the next 2 slides. If you have questions about the way that this works, we can come back to the probability logic that goes into explaining this. But the basic idea you can see would be something like this. Imagine that you were in a coma for about a week. And when you come back, when you come to, let's say that there's somebody at your bedside and they said the most amazing thing happened while you were in a coma. We were visited by extraterrestrials. Now, if one person tells you that, you might think, I don't know, that you're pulling my leg. You're just doing this as a sort of cruel coma joke. But then you get a phone call from somebody who is completely unrelated to the first person. You get a phone call from your mother, and your mother says the same thing. And then the nurse comes in who is completely unrelated to these people and also tells you the same thing. There comes a point after you get so many of these people giving you independent testimony to something very, very incredible and improbable, there does reach a point where those testimonies overcome the initial improbability of the event. And what Hume is trying to say is that you never can have enough evidence to believe a miracle, but what we can show with probability logic is that that claim is false. Set the probability for a miracle as low as you like. Given enough independent eyewitness testimonies that are credible, we're eventually, in principle at least, to overcome it. So if we jump up to slide number 26, I can go over a quick summary of what we've covered and then open things up to questions. Hume's general epistemic argument against miracles, we can say, is an epic failure. The We've seen first that there's the problem of scope. It's either question begging by saying that all experiences exclude miraculous experiences, or it's going to give us other problems if we go with the more narrow and correct interpretation of Hume, where he says that we should use our own personal experience to judge the credibility of others. And these other problems include that, first, our personal experience is not contrary to miracles occurring in general. Number 3, that personal experience can actually be used to support miracles because of the incredibility that people would give testimony for events that they know to be false in exchange for shame, torture, and death. Number 4, we've seen that if Hume's argument is applied across the board consistently, that it would result in the stultification of scientific progress, and that this just isn't the way that scientists actually operate. And number 5, that independent testimony can overcome any improbability that one might have against a miraculous event. In principle, at least, it's possible that we could amass enough evidence to overcome the improbability of believing a miracle. On the next slide, this then leaves us with kind of the final 2 options for somebody who wants to be skeptical about miracles. Without the general epistemic argument against miracles, objections to Christian miracles like the resurrection can only be raised on the grounds either, number 1, that miracles are intrinsically impossible or incoherent or illogical events, that we can't even intelligibly think what a miracle is. Or number 2, they'd have to make the case that miracles are possible and they could possibly be justified by evidence, but it just happens to be the case that no miracle has ever provided adequate evidence to be justified. And while I think most who are skeptical about miracles and who don't believe in the Christian miracles would take the second of these 2, what this leaves us with is then, if you're going to dismiss miraculous claims, you have to be in a position to get your hands dirty with the evidence. You can't just dismiss miraculous claims because they're miraculous claims. You're going to have to look at the particulars. You're going to have to get your hands in there and find out what kind of eyewitness testimony do we have? Did they have something to gain from it or not? Is there corroborating evidence? Do we have the signs that this is the kind of thing that could have been refuted? And what were their refutations of it? And so on. So that for the person who wants to deny that miracles take place, they can't throw out these in principle general epistemic arguments. They're going to have to get their hands dirty with the evidence. And finally, if I can get to the last slide here, I just want to recommend a few sources. You can go online to the Library of Historical Apologetics at historicalapologetics.org, and you can find first William Adams' essay. It's called An Essay on Mr. Hume's Essay on Miracles. It's very short. You can read this in one sitting in your bedroom at night before you go to bed. You can read that and download that for free. I didn't talk about George Campbell, but his short work, A Dissertation on Miracles, is a fantastic read. He has a great way of writing, a very nice touch of rhetoric, and very good arguments. I recommend reading George Campbell as well. Thomas Sherlock, his book, The Trial of the Witnesses, was written before David Hume. I should say about Campbell as well that he is directly engaging Hume in that piece. It is focused entirely on Hume's essay. Sherlock was written before Hume, and what Sherlock is doing is just giving a general defense of the evidence for the resurrection and focusing on whether the eyewitnesses that we find in the Gospels are credible witnesses or not. I'd also recommend William Paley's book, A View of the Evidences of Christianity, as an overview of the evidence we have for the resurrection as well, and the historical grounds we have for making that claim. And then 2 more modern works. I'd recommend C.S. Lewis's book, It's just titled Miracles. It's of C.S. Lewis's work, probably the hardest, but it's still, as far as this topic goes, an accessible piece. And I think with some diligence and effort, people can come to understand, I think, what Lewis's points are. And I think that he makes a very good case in that book, generally speaking, in defense of the possibility of miracles. And finally, the book I talked about earlier, John Earman's book, Hume's Abject Failure. And that book is relatively short, actually. It's divided into two parts. The first part is Earman's part, where he gives a very close and meticulous analysis of Hume. And I think it is very well argued. It goes into very close detail about interpreting and understanding Hume. So for people that are Hume scholars or wanting to understand Hume better, I recommend Earman's book. In the second part, he has excerpts from a number of historical works, including excerpts from George Campbell, Thomas Sherlock, and many others as well.